Okay, now that we've formed a basis in our understanding of unmanaged files, we can talk about managed files. The difference between the two, like we've mentioned before, is that managed files have a database entry associated with the file itself. It also has a different set of API functions to work with it because we're not only working with the file, we are also dealing with the database, and we can also let other modules deal with files and mark their usage of certain files so that when one module deletes a file, it doesn't adversely affect the other modules who still need that file to work. So what we're going to do is rebuild our system, and it'll happen a lot quicker this time because we already know what's happening with the files. Now we need to understand what the minor differences are between the API functions. And we'll just build it all the way through, going from building the form, the initial form, to processing the upload and validating it, to displaying those files, and finally to talking about how to work with private files and managed files. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and collapse this default directory. And go ahead and navigate to your Sites, All Modules, Custom Assets, Steps folder. And we're going to open up the 10th step, which is called Simple Managed Form. Go ahead and copy the entire code from this file and paste it over the code that's currently in your assets.module file and save it. Go ahead and scroll up to the very top. We've added two items here, a menu item and then a function for the menu callback. Let's take a look at the menu item really quick. It's pretty simple. We have a title and description. Our page callback is Drupal get form because this is going to be a simple form page. And then we're passing the argument that creates that form array, which is called assets managed file form. So let's go ahead and scroll down to the very bottom and take a look at this function. All we're doing here is creating a form with two inputs. The first is our managed file input, and our second is the submit input. Now you might remember from building the unmanaged form that we had to set the encoding type for the form as an attribute, but we don't have to do that with a managed file. That happens behind the scenes. So you see we can just start out by creating this managed file input, our submit input, and then returning the form. Let's take a look at the attributes for this managed file input. We have a title, our type is managed file, and this line here looks probably familiar from our previous example, but it's structured a little differently. We have our upload validators, and we're passing that as a parameter to our input. So if we take a look at our unmanaged form, I'm going to go ahead and scroll up so we can see the difference here. Our unmanaged form doesn't take the validators as an input. Instead, we have to use the validation function associated with the form and add our validators that way and run it through save upload. So the managed file input takes away this step of the process and allows us to simply embed the functions that we're going to call to validate within the input itself. And what we're doing here is adding the validators that we had for our managed input, which are our file extensions, using file validate extensions, and then our custom validation function that tests for a particular string inside of our file name, and that's assets validate not file name. And we're passing it test dot to test for test.png or test.jpg. Another new parameter here is the upload location, which sets where our file is going to get uploaded. Again, we had to pass this manually to file save upload, but instead we can pass it as part of the input. The progress indicator parameter can be one of three options, either bar, throbber, or none. This comes into play because with a managed input, unlike an unmanaged input, there's an additional submit button that will allow you to upload the file in an AJAX fashion without submitting the entire form. So you can submit the file and it will display a progress indicator depending on what you have selected here. And you can kind of watch its progress as you go. If it's set to bar and you have a particular extension installed in PHP, you can actually see the progress of the input as it's uploading. By default, though, you'll just see a nice candy stripe animation for the bar. And finally, the progress message parameter specifies the text that displays near the progress indicator. We're setting that to 1 moment while we save your file. Now, as you can probably guess, just from the parameters that we're passing to this input, a lot more happens when we submit this form than happened with our previous unmanaged file form. We get a file that's uploaded to this particular location, and an entry is added into the database. We get all of our validation functions taken care of. And so at this point, we have a fully functioning file upload form. But there's 2 problems with it. And these are particular concepts having to do with managed files. First is that when a file is uploaded via this method, we don't know at the outset whether it's going to be a temporary file or a permanent file. Let's go ahead and jump to the browser and take a look at this input, because I think it will help as a reference point. We need to go ahead and flush our caches to add our new page. And we have it right here. It should show up in your navigation bar, the File API Managed File example. Okay, so you see we have 2 submit buttons here. We have our upload button and our submit button. If we browse for a file, and then we click the upload button, the form isn't submitted, but what we do get is a refreshing of this section where the input would normally be, and now there's a link to the file that we just uploaded. Now what happens if I click this remove button and then add another item? At this point, now we have 2 entries in the database for our files that we've uploaded, but only one of them that we want to keep. So in our submit function, we need to handle making this explicit to Drupal that we want to keep this 1 file out of the 2 that we uploaded. So that's the first problem, is that we can have temporary files, and by default, Drupal marks the files as temporary. Every 6 hours on cron runs, those files that are still temporary will be removed from the database and from the file directory. So if we don't mark it as permanent, then our file will disappear eventually. The other problem that we have is that with managed files, there's also the ability for other modules to use those files and to mark their usage of those files. This is handled by an incrementing number in the database that takes care of registering which modules are using which files. And so if one module decides to delete a file, it first checks to see whether that file is in use by other modules and won't delete it permanently if that's the case. We also need to explicitly state that our module is using this file. Drupal doesn't automatically assume that the form that's being built by this particular module is also the one that's responsible for the file. So we have to explicitly state that. And that's the second thing we need to do in our submit function. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the tables that are tracking both the files and the file usage. I'm going to jump to my database manager here. It's SQL Pro. And I've got the file managed table open right now. This is where the file metadata is being stored. Across the top here, we have the names of the columns and then rows in this table. The FID is the file ID assigned to this particular file. The UID is the user that uploaded it. We have the file name and the URI. And let's go ahead and stop there for a minute. You see we have a number of files that have been uploaded. All of these that begin with the temporary : / were all uploaded through our unmanaged file input. And these are all temporary. These last 2 were uploaded to our managed section. You can see here under assets / managed that they've been moved out of temporary already, and they've been put in our destination folder. And these are also currently marked as temporary. We can see this by looking at the status column here, and a 0 status means temporary. So in 6 hours, if I run cron, all of these files will be purged from this Drupal install. The other table I wanted to point out was file usage right here. Now this is empty right now because even though we've uploaded some files, we haven't marked any of them as being used by a particular module. So when we run our usage count add in our submit function, we'll see a row get entered into this table. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at how we're going to construct our submit function.